This lecture is the recording for the Associative Learning Lecture, which took place in part during early to mid-December and finished up on Tuesday, January 5th. The first section is on classical conditioning. Associative learning is when our brain makes a connection between two things. And with classical conditioning, our brain is making a connection between two types of stimuli. Now, a stimuli is a taste, touch, sight, sound, or smell. And an unconditioned stimulus is something that causes an unconditioned response. So it's something that will stimulate your senses and cause an unconditioned instinctual reactive response. Like if someone clapped their hands in front of your face, the wind from the hands moving would cause your eyelashes to blink automatically. Now, a neutral stimulus is a stimulus that doesn't cause any sort of response. However, when you pair the two stimuli together, so a taste, touch, sight, sound, or smell, along with another, your brain makes an association between the two types of stimuli. And then ultimately, you will respond the same way to the neutral one as you did to the unconditioned one. Except when that happens, the neutral stimulus no longer is neutral. It has now become conditioned because now it is causing a reaction when it didn't prior. And the conditioned response is the same response that you have for the unconditioned one, but just to the new neutral stimulus that has been conditioned. When we talk about Pavlov and his dogs, one thing that Pavlov had his dogs smell food, and the dogs would drool when they smelled food. Then Pavlov would ring a bell, but nothing happened. Eventually, Pavlov paired the sound of the bell, with the smell of the food, and the dogs began drooling, and he began to investigate why. Ultimately, after a number of pairings, he removed the food and found that the dogs themselves drooled from the sound of the bell, in this case, showing that it is a type of classical conditioning. So Pavlov was really instrumental in developing this idea of classical conditioning. John Watson took it a step further in looking at the idea of behaviorism. When John Watson, what he did was essentially test out classical conditioning on an infant child. He wanted to teach fear to this infant child known as little Albert. Now, little Albert, what occurred was that little Albert had no fear of any sort of animals when he was initially brought in. But then Watson struck a steel bar with a hammer, which caused little Albert to be very much afraid. And ultimately, what ended up happening was that as he paired that sound, which scared little Albert, with the touch of the feeling of a white rat, then little Albert began to develop a fear of that white rat, and eventually would fear other things as well. Operant conditioning is when we learn from consequence. Now, it starts with a guy by the name of Edward Thorndike. Edward Thorndike put cats into these boxes that he called his puzzle box. It had a couple of latches and pedals and things like that, and he put fish on the outside. And what he found was that over time, the cats would repeat the behaviors that would get them out of the box faster in order to get the fish earlier. Now, ultimately, he developed what he called his law of effect at this point. And the law of effect essentially just said that when there is a favorable outcome, a certain behavior will be more likely to be repeated, and with an unfavorable outcome, probably unlikely to be repeated. As he saw that when he put no fish out there, the cats wouldn't really choose or really strive to get out of the box as fast as possible. Thorndike's ideas were taken even further by what we know now is kind of like the father of behaviorism, and that's B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner would put rats and also pigeons in what he called his operant conditioning chambers. Now, today we just call them Skinner boxes. And what he would do is the goal would be to get the animal to do some sort of behavior. But if you're talking about this Skinner box here, the basic one was the way that it worked is when a light went on, the rat was expected to press the lever. Now, initially, it had to be shown that when the lever was pressed, food would come out. But when that light went on, and if the rat didn't press the lever, then it would receive a small shock from an electrified grid. However, if it did press the lever, then food pellets would be distributed and the rat would be able to eat. And in this way, he demonstrated that with consequences, the behavior of species, including human beings, can be changed. Ultimately, operant conditioning is shaping behavior through consequence. And uh, when we talk about operant conditioning, there are good consequences that we call reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when we get something good added to us in order to keep a desired behavior to keep it occurring. So an example would be, let's say that you got money for getting good grades in school. That would be an example of positive reinforcement. You're getting money and it keeps you doing the same thing. Negative reinforcement is when we get something bad removed from us, which we still perceive as a good action. And with negative reinforcement, one example would be in your car, if you don't buckle your seatbelt, it makes a really incessant dinging sound. What's the desired behavior? The desired behavior is that you buckle your seatbelt. And so once you do that, the dinging stops, getting you to repeat that behavior over and over again so that you can either avoid or remove that undesired behavior. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that we instinctually know to be good. This includes things like food and water and even positive praise. Conditioned reinforcers are reinforcers that we have to learn. We have to make some sort of association and some learning of that these reinforcers have value. A perfect example of this is money. When you grow up, when you're a little kid, you don't know the value of money, but through life experiences, your brain connects money with positive experience. And in that case, then you begin to realize its value and it becomes a reinforcer. Punishments are bad consequences and are designed to stop certain behaviors. Positive punishment would be when you get something undesirable added to you in order to stop a behavior. So, like if you do something bad and then you get extra chores. A negative punishment is when you get something good taken away, which would then get you to stop a desired behavior. For example, if you do something bad and you get your phone taken away. There are some certain characteristics of operant conditioning. One is that it's active learning. Active learning basically just means that uh, people are making an active choice to choose which consequence to receive. Unlike classical conditioning, which is much more passive and occurs much more unconsciously. Second, conditioning is reciprocal. What I mean by that is when someone is conditioning you, you are conditioning back. And you can even use this example with animals. When I trained my dog to go to the bathroom outside, in doing so, when he went to the bathroom, I would give him a treat. That was my desired behavior for him. And the treat was my reinforcement. However, his desired behavior of me was that I give him treats. And so he reinforced that behavior by going to the bathroom more and more and more. So conditioning is always reciprocal. And finally, intent doesn't matter. Only the behavior matters. I've repeated this story a couple of times in class, but when I was a kid, my sister and I would get into fights. And if I hit her, she would go and cry to my parents, using it as a punishment to try to get me to stop what I was doing. However, once she was done crying to them and I was done getting in trouble by my parents, I would turn around and hit her harder. So in truth, even though the intent was that it was a punishment, in fact, it was a reinforcer. Now, psychology says that using both reinforcers and punishments are probably the best method. However, there is some, if you're going to stick with one, reinforcement tends to be just a little bit better. There is some problems with punishment. One problem is that it teaches fear and avoidance of the consequence, but not actually a changing of a behavior. So in truth, when someone stops doing a certain behavior, it's not because they are looking to stop the behavior, but just looking to avoid the consequence. Secondly, physical punishment models aggression as a solution. When we talk about observational learning, we're going to see that people learn through other people's actions, and when especially kids are punished physically, the way they solve problems is using physical violence and aggression. Overall, take a look at this chart. This just kind of helps organize the ideas of positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. Now, for both classical and operant conditioning, we have 5 distinct processes that apply to both. Acquisition is when conditioning is fully set. So with classical conditioning, it's when the conditioned stimulus alone would cause the certain response, and with operant conditioning, It's when the behavior occurs without the consequence afterwards. And so that's called acquisition, when a person has acquired the conditioning and their behavior or has changed, or they have made more of the connections between the stimuli. Extinction is when that conditioning goes away. Pavlov's dogs, if they were not fed enough, would eventually stop drooling to that bell. And a person who doesn't receive a reinforcer may not continue to do the same behavior if they know that they're not going to get a reward. However, if there is a time between extinction, what can happen is what's called spontaneous recovery. And that's where conditioning returns kind of spontaneously, because at one point, the sound of a bell meant food, or the consequent, or someone's action was given a reinforcer type consequence that gets them to do the behavior again. However, if the consequence isn't given, if that reinforcer isn't given, or if that food isn't present, extinction will occur even more quickly. Sometimes conditioning can happen even with not the exact same stimuli or the exact same consequence. And this is called stimulus generalization, which basically says that if a stimuli or a consequence is similar enough to the original one, it will still cause the same result. So if Pavlov's dogs heard a doorbell rather than Pavlov's bell, they might still drool. And if a person receives a similar reinforcer to what they had received before, they might still maintain that same behavior. Discrimination is exactly the opposite. With discrimination, it's basically the idea that if it's too different, it's not going to cause that same response. So if there was an absolutely different sound, it wouldn't be similar enough to a bell, and the dogs wouldn't drool. Or if someone received a reinforcer, but it wasn't anywhere close to what they had got before, they might not still maintain that same behavior. Ultimately, continuous reinforcement is going to be the best when we're talking about operant conditioning. It's going to be the best and will maintain the highest level of changed behavior. However, it does remove motivation from a lot of people because instead of working to change their behavior, they're just working to get the reward. On the other hand, partial and intermittent reinforcement is incredibly effective. And that's where reinforcement isn't always given, because trying to give reinforcement all the time is also, frankly, unrealistic, too. And partial or intermittent reinforcement can be very effective because a person knows that reinforcement will still occur, even if it's not every single time. There are 4 distinct reinforcement schedules of partial or intermittent reinforcements. A fixed ratio schedule is when a subject receives reinforcement after a specific and set number of behaviors. So, for example, if you have a Jamba Juice discount card that says buy 10 Jamba Juices and get 1 free, then what's the desired behavior? It's to buy Jamba Juice. So you do that 10 times and then you get your reinforcement, which is the free one. A variable ratio reinforcement schedule is when a person or a subject is reinforced after a random number of that certain behavior. A good example of this would be a slot machine. You pull the desired behavior is that you put money in and pull the slot machine's handle. If you do that, you might get reinforced after the first time, but it might take 20 times until you get reinforced. Now, once you get reinforced, it'll, again, only serve to strengthen that conditioning, which would cause you to then put more money in that slot machine looking for the next reinforcement. A fixed interval reinforcement schedule is when an individual or a subject receives reinforcement after a specific amount of time, a very set and certain and specific amount of time. An example of this would be the paycheck that you receive from work. The desired behavior is that you show up at work and you do a good job, and in doing so, then you get reinforced every 2 weeks or every month or whatever. Finally, we have a variable interval reinforcement schedule, and that's when we get reinforced after random amounts of time. And a good example of this is social media. If you post a picture, which is the desired behavior on Instagram, and then you get a like 10 minutes later, it's going to make you more likely to post a picture later in the future, especially if you start getting a like over and over and over again, which is consistent and constant reinforcement. Ultimately, the 5 processes of associative learning apply to both classical and operant conditioning, while the reinforcement schedules work primarily only through operant conditioning and receiving consequences. And that is the end of the lecture.